Okay, welcome back to How Do We Do Science and talking about research on ecosystems. This is part two of our introduction to ecosystems so that we have a basis for how we actually will then go out and do some research on them and know what type of information we should be looking for. Um, and if you remember from part one of our video, that ecosystems have two parts, one living and the second part is non-living, okay? And that those both occur in one place, okay? So in one place we have a living and non-living sections, and that the non-living is often what we're saying, what we should be meaning of the environment, okay? The environment is actually what we call all the non-living parts of an ecosystem. Okay? So when you take the non-living parts, the environment, and you combine it with all the living parts, you have an ecosystem. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about what are those non-living or abiotic factors, those things that make up the environment. The things that make up the environment are going to be one, resources, and the conditions that we find in that specific place. So there's physical resources, the things that are there, the materials, the ground, the water, all those types of things. But then there's other conditions, the things like the weather and things that will impact on the ecosystem. Okay, so we'll talk about the resources and the conditions. So what are the resources in a specific area? Well, if we look at this picture in the background, we can see that there is what we would call soil or substrate, okay, if it's in the water or aquatic. So you have the soil. Is it made of sand or is it rocky? Is it made of clay? What are the different things in the soil? If it's aquatic, if it's underwater, we don't call it soil, we call it substrate. We use a different word. But what's the bottom of the water like? Is it sandy or rocky, muddy? What's going on there? So depends on where we're talking, on the left on the ground or over on the right in the stream. But we're talking about the material of the earth. What's in it? Is it acidic? All those different things. So we could talk about the soil, and that's important because it's a resource for plants and animals, and they interact with them. So the soil could affect the plants that grow there. The substrate in the water might affect how different fish interact with the bottom, all sorts of different things. So we might also be talking about what minerals are in the environment. Is there enough nitrates and phosphates in the soil? Are there nitrates and phosphates in the water? Those types of things that are resources for the living things that they need to grow. If you're talking about the environment and minerals, that can be important, but also related to that is oxygen and carbon dioxide, maybe either in the air for animals to breathe or dissolved in the water for the fish. There's some various different things that we might consider to be resources in an ecosystem. But we also have different environmental conditions, different things that affect the environment. So we have the climate or the weather. Okay? Weather is really a description of what's happening today. Climate is a description of what is the weather like for the whole year in a specific place. But we also have maybe water quality. So let's look at climate and weather and then water quality. So what's the difference between climate and weather? Well, there's a lot of things that make up the weather. How much sunlight is there? Is it very sunny or is there not much sunlight? Are you on the equator where there's 12 hours of sunlight a day? Or are you on the Arctic where you might have 6 months of sunlight and 6 months of darkness? That can be a pretty big impact on what can live there. Precipitation, that's the scientific word for rain. How much rain? It also, precipitation includes snow and other things, moisture falling to the earth. So how much water is coming to that? Are there monsoons or is there very little rain? What's the temperature? Temperature can be affected by lots of different things, but the sunlight, the amount of moisture and rain, the temperature, as well as the altitude, how high up you are, because that affects temperature and precipitation. These things come together to create a specific type of climate where you live. So, do you live in Florida here in the U.S. where there's maybe lots of hurricanes, so there's lots of rain, and it's close to the equator and it's very warm? And those types of things will have an impact. Okay, as well as the wind. So, are you in a very windy place? Wind can cause it to be very dry, but wind could also cause lots of storms like this to blow in off of the ocean. Okay. If you're in the water, you're not so worried about the weather as you are the water quality. So climate and weather is more about on the land and the air, but if you're in a ecosystem in underwater, you are more interested in the water quality factors. These things we've studied a lot in our water unit. So the pH, is it acid or is it alkaline? How much dissolved oxygen is there? How much dissolved carbon dioxide is in the water? And how do those things, what are the amounts available for living things? Visibility or the clarity of the water. We looked at the turbidity. How well can the living things see through the water? How much sunlight can get to the plants? Those are things that if you're looking at water quality, you should be, investigating these types of factors. Okay? And if it's water, is it salt water? Is it fresh water? Or is it brackish, like the mangroves, where it's both salt and fresh coming together, so it's kind of in between? These are all factors that you might investigate for water quality if it's an aquatic. And another important one is flow rate. Is it a nice calm pond where the water just sits still? Or is it a very fast-moving river with waterfalls and things? Because that will affect the dissolved oxygen, and that'll affect the visibility and all sorts of things. Okay? So, when we're talking about ecosystems, it's important to remember that it's the living and the non-living parts connected. How do the plants affect the leopard here? But how is the temperature affecting the plants and the leopard? How about the amount of rain? Do the plants affect the minerals in the ground? And is the leopard affecting the other animals that are there? How are all of these things starting to connect? We often get many links between all the different parts. Those are important things to consider when we talk about ecosystems. And in the one world factor, it's not just talking about the environment because it's a leopard. If we're going to talk about one world environment, we need to talk about, well, if something happens to the leopard, how does that have an impact on the other living things, on the plants and on the animals that it hunts? But also then, how does that relate to the non-living parts? You have to include both of those in your discussion. Okay? And there's some words that you might come across in your research that are important when we talk about an ecosystem. One of those is habitat. And habitat really is about where something lives. And it can be both the living and the non-living. So for instance, monkeys might live in trees. That's their habitat. It's where they live. But that's dependent both on the living, the tree, and the non-living, because that impacts the temperature and all of those things. Okay, so you might come across this word habitat, and that really is including both of those. Okay? Now, important things to note. Living things use the resources in the environment. Okay? The larger the population, the more resources they use. So the more and more living things you have, the more of an impact they will have on the environment, on the non-living resources. So a single leopard does not have the same kind of impact as maybe the thousands of plants. The more living things, the more of an impact they have. Okay? So that's an important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about the impact. Okay? If we're talking about animals such as the elephants, okay, well, if it's only one elephant, if they're almost extinct, they might not have a very big impact uh, on the ecosystem. But if we have a large farm with thousands and thousands of cows, then they might have a much larger impact. So again, think in scale. How many are there? Okay. The idea being ecosystems, living and non-living things, related to each other, and they affect each other. It's not just one affecting the other. Okay. Everything is connected. In our next section of videos, we're going to actually talk about what should you be researching. We've got a little bit of background on ecosystems. What should we start to investigate and research? Okay. And in order to do that, we're going to be looking at some impacts on the ecosystems. So you'll want to bring in some of the things we've been talking about, such as pollution, sizes of populations, and the use of the resource. These are all things that are connected to our water quality as well. We talked about pollution and the human use, the population, and how that affects the resource use in a specific area, that geographical impact there.